A monastery meant to escape corruption became powerful enough to challenge bishops, nobles, and eventually even the papacy itself. A reformer crossed burning coals because a bishop refused to answer accusations of buying his sacred office. Monks renounced private property, then watched their monasteries accumulate estates so vast that reform itself became wealthy. 3 pilgrims walked toward Rome in 1048, and their quiet journey helped ignite a revolution in church government. One reformer declared that sacraments sold for money were invalid, pushing the struggle against simony toward a dangerous edge. A pope marched against Norman warriors, lost the battle, and became their prisoner while trying to reform Christianity. The church tried to free itself from kings, but that question would soon place pope and emperor on a collision course. Before popes could challenge kings, renewal began with monks asking a dangerous question: who truly owned the church? The reform story begins with a church that could no longer hide its contradictions. Sacred offices had become prizes in a violent political world. Bishoprics could be purchased, monasteries became shelters for ambitious nobles, and religious authority was often bent toward private advantage. For believers who took the church's claims seriously, this was more than disorder. It looked like betrayal of the entire Christian calling. The call for renewal did not originate as a Roman blueprint. It rose instead as a moral protest against visible corruption. Its unexpected starting point was not a commanding papal court, but monasteries already entangled in the corruption reformers wanted to confront. Norse and Hungarian raids had destroyed many houses, while surviving monasteries often became convenient rewards for abbots seeking comfort or income. Some men obtained abbeys by purchase, ignored Benedict's rule, and treated monastic property as though it were another source of family wealth. Yet the older ideal had not disappeared, and monks and nuns still appeared who believed their vocation demanded something far stricter. Hildegard of Bingen would later embody that desire for a profound spiritual life, though reforming communities themselves could eventually become vulnerable to corruption. That tension became the central problem. How could a community escape the political pressures that had compromised so many earlier foundations? Burgundy supplied a possible solution. One monastery would be organized to resist dependence on the patrons whose gifts enabled its foundation. Its name was Cluny, and its founders hoped legal independence could protect a spiritual experiment from feudal control. What began as a local solution in 909 would become the center of a vast reforming network stretching across Western Europe. But the success of Cluny would create a new question that every renewal movement eventually faces. What happens when reform itself acquires power? The crisis touched property, office, discipline, and worship, because every reform raised the same deeper question: who had the right to govern the church? In 909, Duke William III founded Cluny in Burgundy and deliberately sought a monastery that powerful patrons could support without controlling. William did not invent monastic reform, but he made several decisions that gave this particular foundation unusual room to breathe. He invited Berno, a monk already respected for obedience to Benedict's rule and for earlier reforming work, to lead the new community. At Berno's request, William also set aside a favored hunting ground for the monastery's use and long-term support. Then, William made the decision that changed everything. He placed Cluny under distant papal jurisdiction precisely because Rome was too weak to dominate it. That arrangement sounds like submission to Rome, but in the political world of the 10th century, it could function as protection. The papacy was then at a low point, and distant papal authority threatened Cluny less than nearby bishops, nobles, or William's own heirs. William's charter, therefore, tried to ensure that neither pope, bishop, lord, nor founder could simply seize the monastery's property. Cluny belonged, in principle, only to the apostles, whose names appeared in the charter, making earthly patrons guardians rather than owners. This legal fiction created something spiritually practical: space in which monks could attempt Benedictine discipline without constant feudal interference. Berno governed until 926, and also worked with several other monasteries, so the reforming impulse quickly reached beyond Cluny's own walls. Cluny's decisive test came after Berno's death, when capable successors kept his program intact instead of allowing it to dissolve. Odo, Aymard, Mayol, Odilo, and Hugh extended Cluny's influence across generations, creating continuity rarely seen in Western institutions of that age. 6 abbots of exceptional ability and longevity carried the house across roughly 2 centuries of political instability and ecclesiastical change. Their achievement went beyond preserving one house. They made Cluny a model other communities deliberately sought to copy across the West. Repeated imitations soon created something much larger than one monastery, almost a monastic empire operating without an emperor. Freedom from one local lord solved only the first problem. Expansion now forced Cluny to coordinate many dependent houses under one system. Centralized government gave Cluny unusual strength and consistency, but that same efficiency also prepared the ground for a later contradiction. Cluny's answer to rapid expansion was centralization. Dependent houses surrendered much local independence to one abbot, creating something medieval Europe had barely seen. Instead, they were gathered into a network under the direct authority of the abbot of Cluny. The abbot appointed priors to dependent houses, giving the movement a centralized structure that could carry reform across regions and political boundaries. This was not technically a modern religious order, but the resemblance was strong enough to shape later monastic organization. Communities of women also entered the reforming world, including Marceny, founded while Hugh served as abbot of Cluny in the 11th century. The monk's central occupation was no longer agricultural labor, but the divine office, the repeated cycle of communal prayer. Cluniac devotion then introduced another strain. Benedict's rhythm of prayer expanded until worship occupied an extraordinary share of the monastic day. At its height, Cluniac monks sang 138 psalms daily, and that astonishing devotion carried a hidden cost. Liturgical observance grew increasingly elaborate, ceremonies multiplied, and the long hours devoted to prayer steadily displaced manual work from ordinary monastic life. Cluny justified this change by insisting that prayer itself was the monk's highest work and most valuable service. With less time assigned to the fields, monks concentrated more fully on worship, intercession, and the elaborate ceremonies surrounding communal prayer. At first, this concentration gave the reform enormous moral prestige in a church exhausted by worldly ambition. Because Cluny depended less on local lords, its leaders could criticize bishops, nobles, and even popes with a freedom others rarely possessed. To many observers, the movement looked almost miraculous, a sign that disciplined Christian life could survive political decay. The donations that protected Cluny from local domination kept accumulating, until institutional independence produced wealth beyond anything the earliest reformers had envisioned. The danger now came from inside the achievement itself. Cluny's success was creating problems that no hostile lord had imposed. Cluny's paradox was becoming visible. Spiritual credibility attracted gifts, and those gifts gradually recreated forms of wealth the original reform had resisted. By then, Cluny faced a sharper contradiction. Individual monks possessed nothing, while the institutions surrounding them controlled increasingly extensive estates. Generations of grateful patrons donated property for prayers and spiritual benefits, allowing Cluny and its dependent houses to accumulate enormous resources. In theory, this wealth belonged to the community rather than any monk, preserving the Benedictine prohibition against private property. In practice, vast holdings required administration, invited political relationships, and made the monastery increasingly attractive to the powerful world it had resisted. This liturgical schedule left less room for manual labor, which had once occupied a larger share of monastic life. By the 11th century, the tension was unmistakable. An anti-corruption movement now appeared surrounded by property, social prestige, and elaborate ceremonial life. The same pattern appeared elsewhere whenever successful monasteries gained estates, rights, patrons, and influence over surrounding communities. Wealth did not automatically destroy monastic discipline, but it made poverty harder to proclaim when the institution itself lived like a great lord. The stakes reached beyond Cluny because the wider church increasingly treated reformed monasteries as models for Christian renewal. Monks who criticized episcopal worldliness while administering great estates risked weakening their own moral case. Observers could see the inconsistency clearly. The issue went beyond hypocrisy. Property had originally helped monasteries escape dependence on powerful patrons and preserve autonomy. Yet the resources that secured independence could also generate comfort, influence, and temptation, turning the reform's protection into a fresh source of danger. So a new generation asked the question Cluny could no longer avoid. Had Benedict's rule been softened too far? Their answer would produce another reform, one that tried to recover stricter poverty precisely by rejecting Cluny's accumulated wealth and ceremony. Before that reaction fully emerged, however, monastic ideas were already escaping the cloister and entering a much more explosive debate. The question was no longer only how monks should live, but whether priests, bishops, and the entire clergy should be remade on monastic lines. That shift would turn reform from an internal monastic experiment into a conflict capable of tearing cities apart. Then reform crossed the monastery wall and entered ordinary clerical life, focusing on two explosive targets: purchased church offices and married priests. Buying or selling sacred office came to be called simony, and reformers treated it as a direct assault on the church. The appointment and investiture of bishops and abbots by kings, nobles, and emperors appeared dangerously close to that same corrupt exchange. Clerical marriage was more complicated because married priests had existed for centuries without provoking the same universal condemnation. The next demand was far more personal. Reformers shaped by monastic celibacy insisted that priests renounce marriage and live sexually like monks. The result was not a peaceful change in discipline, but a social conflict reaching directly into clerical households. In Milan, activists known as the Patarines attacked what they regarded as the corruption of married and simoniac clergy. The city became a battleground. Some extremists called priests' wives harlots and demanded that they be expelled from their husbands' homes. Families that had considered themselves legitimate suddenly found reformers treating their marriages as scandalous violations, requiring public separation. The cost became personal. The controversy became especially fierce in Florence, where opponents accused the bishop himself of obtaining office through simony. John Galbert of Vallombrosa supported the accusation, while Peter Damian, another major reformer, urged restraint, patience, and proper judgment. Their methods sharply diverged. Then Florence pushed the argument beyond sermons and councils, toward an ordeal no crowd could easily ignore. A supporter of Gualbert crossed a blazing path of coals in an ordeal intended to prove the bishop's guilt before the city. When the monk survived, many Florentines accepted the ordeal as divine confirmation that the accusation was true. The bishop fled. Clerical families were driven from their homes, and the streets witnessed the destructive power of reforming certainty. Renewal now carried violence. Renewal had become capable of producing courage, fanaticism, discipline, humiliation, and violence within the same movement. Yet beneath the excesses stood a lasting principle. Church office should not be a private possession controlled by money, inheritance, or marriage. That principle would soon move from city streets into papal policy, where its political consequences would become even greater. Cluny's wealth produced its own answer. A stricter movement at Citeaux would try to recover the poverty and simplicity reform itself had lost. Robert of Malem founded a community at Citeaux late in the 11th century after becoming dissatisfied with existing monastic life. Citeaux aimed to strip away accumulated comfort, returning to stricter observance and a more demanding understanding of Benedict's original rule. Poverty became the test. Then Bernard arrived, and a struggling experiment suddenly found the personality capable of turning austerity into a movement. Bernard's arrival transformed the community because his charisma attracted recruits in numbers large enough to establish new houses almost immediately. Growth followed with speed. When Citeaux grew crowded, Bernard was sent to found Clairvaux, which quickly became another center of reform. Bernard entered monastic life to escape public ambition, but his growing reputation would drag him into the very conflicts he hoped to avoid. Bernard's retreat provided no shelter. Repeated appeals for judgment kept pulling him away from the seclusion he claimed to want. His reputation as a preacher and spiritual authority made kings, bishops, and rival church parties seek his judgment in dangerous disputes. He became known as Dr. Mellifluous, the honey-tongued teacher whose words carried extraordinary persuasive power. Bernard intervened in papal conflicts, defended ecclesiastical reform, opposed theological innovation, and eventually preached the Second Crusade. His influence became immense. The Cistercians echoed Cluny's trajectory, beginning as protest and becoming an institution whose influence reached far beyond one monastery. The irony deepened. Leaders who sought withdrawal gained authority precisely because of that discipline, and success repeatedly returned them to public controversy and politics. The more seriously they pursued separation from worldly power, the more urgently the wider church asked them to confront it. By the middle of the 11th century, this monastic, moral energy was flowing directly toward Rome and the institution of the papacy. The next reformers would not merely found houses, they would attempt to redesign the government of Western Christianity. Moral zeal could ignite reform, but it could not govern an entire church. Lasting renewal required rules strong enough to outlive charismatic reformers. The most famous legal achievement came later, around 1140, in a compilation commonly known as Gratian's Decretum. Its anonymous or uncertain author attempted to gather, coordinate, and reconcile the many laws that had accumulated throughout Christian history. Reform became legal order. The work joined existing documents into a coherent legal framework, rather than inventing an entirely new church constitution. Over time, this collection formed the foundation of the Corpus Juris Canonici, the central body of Roman Catholic canon law, until 1917. This legal development marked a change. Renewal was taking institutional form, capable of surviving the reformers who had launched it. Rules concerning elections, clerical conduct, property, discipline, and authority could now be argued through an increasingly shared legal vocabulary. Institutions were hardening around principles. But law could not solve the most dangerous problem. Who controlled the Pope, who was supposed to reform everyone else? For the reform to reach the entire Western Church, men committed to monastic ideals had to enter the papal system itself. In 1048, that shift took human form, as a small reforming circle traveled to Rome beside an unusually chosen papal candidate. Their journey would connect Cluniac independence, anti-simony zeal, clerical discipline, and papal authority into one increasingly coherent program. Rome became the new center. Three names mattered especially in that moment: Bruno of Toul, Humbert, and a monk called Hildebrand. Together, they represented different temperaments, but all believed that a church controlled by money and secular appointment required radical renewal. Agreement never meant moderation. Bruno of Toul faced this crossroads after the emperor had already offered him the papal throne. But Hildebrand reportedly persuaded him that imperial nomination alone was not enough to make a reforming pope legitimate. Consent had to matter. Bruno therefore entered Rome dressed as a pilgrim, seeking acceptance from the city's clergy and people before assuming office. The gesture was symbolically powerful because it placed consent and ecclesiastical legitimacy above the emperor's ability simply to fill the papal throne. Once Bruno became Leo IX, reform changed scale. A monastic protest was becoming an international papal campaign. Beside him stood Humbert, a monk from Lotharingia whose hostility toward simony was sharper and more uncompromising than almost anyone else's. Humbert's treatise against the simoniacs attacked the purchase of church office with a severity that shocked even fellow reformers. Humbert pushed anti-simony logic toward a frightening conclusion. Sacraments performed by corrupt clergy might be invalid, threatening ordinary Christians with spiritual uncertainty.
If accepted, ordinary believers might suddenly doubt baptisms, ordinations, marriages, and Eucharists received from compromised priests.
This was precisely the kind of radical conclusion later reformers often avoided, even while agreeing that simony itself had to disappear. The third traveler, Hildebrand, came from humbler origins and had been formed deeply by monastic ideals of obedience. His father was said to have been a carpenter, making Hildebrand's rise an example of the social mobility still possible within church institutions. He had previously served Pope Gregory VI and followed him into exile when that pope was forced from office. Hildebrand seemed quieter than Humbert, but that quiet monk would eventually make the papacy itself the engine of reform. He remained outside the papal office for years, while experience, alliances, and influence accumulated around him across successive pontificates. Across roughly 25 years, Hildebrand watched reforming popes succeed and fail, drawing the conclusion that papal authority itself must enforce the program. That future still lay ahead, but the machinery of reform was already beginning to move under Leo IX. What happened next would show both the astonishing reach of the new papacy and the dangers of trying to reform Europe from Rome. Leo immediately tested the new papal ambition. Instead of waiting in Rome, he carried reform across the Alps and directly into northern European churches. In Germany, he found support from Emperor Henry III, who had already acted against simony within his own territories. Leo reaffirmed those efforts while making clear that imperial concern for reform did not mean emperors could simply govern ecclesiastical life. Cooperation looked easy, while Pope and Emperor wanted the same reforms. Crisis began when their definitions of authority diverged. In France, Leo moved aggressively against clergy accused of purchasing office and summoned councils that forced public investigation of powerful churchmen. At one council, several prelates were deposed after charges of simony were examined before the assembled clergy. The same gathering also addressed clerical marriage, ordering married bishops and priests to separate from their wives or cease marital relations. Reform was becoming standardized. Simony and clerical marriage were treated not as local problems, but as universal abuses. Peter Damian shared the basic program while repeatedly warning that zeal could become cruelty when reformers forgot patience, evidence, and charity. Humbert represented the opposite tendency, pushing principles toward their hardest logical conclusions and trusting discipline more than compromise. Leo had to hold these temperaments together while presenting the papacy as an authority capable of judging churches across national boundaries. Each successful intervention changed expectations. Europeans were learning that a pope might judge churches far beyond Rome. A pontiff was becoming less a local Roman bishop and more the active head of a reforming movement that claimed jurisdiction everywhere. That expansion of papal authority brought prestige, but it also created enemies among rulers, bishops, and clergy accustomed to older arrangements. And when Leo stepped beyond councils into military action, the moral confidence of reform would meet a much harder political reality. Military action exposed another weakness. Spiritual authority could demand obedience, but a pope at war still needed soldiers. That gamble would imprison Leo, while another papal decision sent Humbert east on a mission whose effects endured for centuries. Reform had gained momentum, but the movement was about to learn that power always creates risks of its own. Leo now tested reform beyond councils, choosing armed force against the Normans and personally leading the campaign. Peter Damian urged him to abandon the military expedition, but Leo chose to march at the head of troops. The campaign ended badly when the Normans defeated the papal army and took the Pope himself prisoner after the battle. Leo remained in captivity until shortly before his death, a humiliating reminder that spiritual authority did not guarantee military success. Defeat did not end Leo's risks. Another decision placed the uncompromising Humbert in delicate negotiations with Constantinople, where temperament would matter enormously. Humbert's uncompromising personality proved especially dangerous in negotiations requiring restraint, patience, and careful attention to centuries of difference. In 1054, he placed a sentence of excommunication against Patriarch Michael Cerularius on the high altar of Hagia Sophia. That dramatic act became one of the defining episodes associated with the growing schism between Eastern and Western Christianity. The rupture had deeper causes than one angry legate, but Humbert's action revealed how reforming certainty could harden disagreement into separation. Leo was already dead when some of these consequences fully unfolded, leaving the movement without its most visible leader. Yet the failures did not reverse reform. Instead, they persuaded many participants that papal institutions themselves needed stronger and more reliable rules. A deeper problem remained. A papacy dependent on emperors for succession could never reform others with full independence. Solving that weakness would alter papal elections and strengthen the institution that still chooses popes today. And behind the new system stood Hildebrand, the quiet reformer who had now survived several pontificates and learned from each disaster. After Leo, the reformers faced a practical vulnerability. Every papal succession could return their work to the control of emperors or Roman factions. Victor II carried the program forward only briefly. Lasting protection required changing the mechanism by which future popes reached office. Under Nicholas II, a council in 1059 established a new electoral system, giving the leading role to cardinals, who were also bishops. Those cardinal bishops would identify a candidate, seek broader consent, and then involve the remaining cardinals and Roman people. The word cardinal had ancient roots, but the reform transformed cardinals into a more clearly defined body responsible for papal succession. The arrangement addressed one weakness while redistributing authority, giving cardinals greater control over succession and reducing the emperor's direct influence. Imperial rulers consequently lost much of their traditional leverage over who occupied the papal throne, although the broader contest over authority remained unresolved. Alexander II followed Nicholas and continued reform, again with Hildebrand serving near the center of papal government. By then, Hildebrand had become the movement's most experienced strategist, linking monastic discipline with a far larger theory of papal responsibility. He believed the church needed freedom from simony, clerical marriage, and secular domination if reform was to endure. He also increasingly imagined the Pope as the obedient head of Christendom, resembling an abbot whose authority served a disciplined spiritual community. That vision was attractive because it promised unity, but it also placed papal claims directly against royal traditions. The reformers had solved one problem by weakening outside control over elections, only to create a larger struggle over authority throughout Europe. The unresolved struggle awaited the strategist who helped shape this system and would eventually inherit its highest office. After years of watching reforms advance and collapse, Hildebrand reached the papal throne, determined to turn temporary crisis measures into a permanent program. Taking the name Gregory VII, he inherited a reforming movement already burdened with enormous expectations across the Western Church. He saw simony not as an isolated financial abuse, but as a system allowing secular power to possess offices belonging to the Church. He regarded clerical celibacy as part of the same struggle for independence from family inheritance and private advantage. His conception of unity extended beyond local reform toward a Western Church increasingly organized around obedience to Roman authority. He could also imagine broader projects, including cooperation with Eastern Christians and military action in lands under Muslim control. His unrealized projects exposed a larger ambition. Rome was no longer satisfied with survival, and papal leadership now imagined reshaping Christendom itself. A movement born in monasteries had become a papal project, claiming responsibility for reshaping Christian society. But one institution still possessed the power, tradition, and practical necessity to resist that claim: the medieval empire and its king. Kings appointed bishops because bishops governed land,
commanded resources, and served political functions no ruler could easily surrender. Gregory believed those same appointments corrupted the church by making sacred office dependent on the favor of secular rulers. For a time, these competing assumptions could coexist whenever Pope and King happened to support the same candidates. The arrangement would collapse when reformers in Milan challenged clerical practices, and King Henry IV decided that royal authority required intervention. Renewal was leaving monastic correction behind and moving toward a constitutional struggle over the structure of Christian authority.